talk about how to interpret correlations. I'm going to speak with you about situations or examples where you might actually use correlational statistics. The first example is in prediction. When we have variables that have a known relationship or a known correlation, a systematic relationship, it's possible to use the score on one variable to predict somebody's score on another variable. One example of this is SAT scores in college performance. So the reason why SAT scores are administered is to make a prediction about how someone will do out there in the world in college. There is an existing positive correlation between these two things. Now, whether the SAT score is the best measure of or best predictor of college performance is somewhat up for debate right now, but a relationship does exist. So I can predict based on somebody's SAT scores how they might do in college. There are always going to be differences. There's always going to be exceptions to the rule. But when we have a correlation, we can make a pretty educated guess as to how well somebody will do. Validity is another application of correlation. Sometimes we use validity to figure out if two different tests are measuring the same thing. We can do this by finding if the scores on those two measures correlate. So for example, let's say I'm giving the personality test the MMPI, or the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Instrument. And I also give somebody the Big Five personality instrument. If I correlate those two scores, I can figure out if they're measuring the same thing. Sometimes you're developing a new instrument and you want it to measure something that is the same as some other measure. So you're looking for that correlation to be there. So we use correlation sometimes to see if two different measures are measuring the same thing. Along the measurement line, we also use correlation in reliability analysis. So sometimes we give a person a test on two different occasions and we correlate the results of those two tests. Why would we do that? Well, sometimes tests need to be consistent over time. Let's say, for example, again, that you're measuring personality. Personality is thought to be a pretty stable characteristic. So you've put together this beautiful personality measure, you give it to somebody in week 1, you give it to them again 3 weeks later, and their scores are radically different. That tells you something about your personality measure. Maybe it's not measuring what you think it is. So reliability is a coefficient that can be calculated by measuring the same person on two different tests to see if there's consistency. And finally, correlation can be used in theory verification. So it can help a researcher to establish if a theory confirms what their prior thoughts were about the relationship between two variables. So let's say, for example, that I have a theory about how physical punishment can be harmful to children's psychosocial development. So I can look at some correlations along those lines to kind of test my theory to see if my theory has some support. In the next video, I'm going to speak with you about some issues in interpretation.